Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to come to your lovely country from Scotland. And one thing we've got in common, it's raining and cold in Scotland as well, so I feel very much at home. Who I am, Niven Rennie. I'm going to try and talk slowly because I've got a Scottish accent. I've never been translated before as I speak, so thank you so much for all you're doing. Director of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. I was 31 years as a police officer, and then I did 2 years working with a homeless persons charity before I became the third director of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit about 18 months ago. Scotland, that yellow bit up there in the British Isles, for those of you who don't know, we've got lots of scenery, lovely hills. You don't have many hills, we've got hills. And we've got the city of Edinburgh, one of the world's cultural sites. And I come from the city of Glasgow, and I'm going to be talking a lot about Glasgow. Population of 650,000 people, and it's reinventing itself as a conference centre. Next year, the World Health Organization will hold a very important climate change conference in Glasgow, 200 heads of state coming. So it has reinvented itself from where it was, and I'll talk about that. Known for whiskey, Loch Ness Monster, and we have lots of natural resources, wind and water power. Very famous man, I don't know how many people of you know Robert Burns, my hero. I lived a long time ago, a lot of songs and poems, including Old Lang Syne that we sing at New Year, but that I'll come back to him as well. Rangers and Celtic, football teams, Andy Murray from the tennis. And very famous, Scotland against Estonia, the game where Estonia didn't turn up. That was Scotland that you were playing. And Braveheart, and William Wallace. We're known for violence. And I became a director of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit 18 months ago, and just after I started, this appeared in the BBC News, and I'll read it to you. Murder capital of Europe, role model for London. So why was that? Well, that's what they're seeing in the streets of London just now. And there's a lot of publicity about it. Young people losing their lives daily. And the headlines in the papers that nobody ever wants to see. And that was our story. That was the story in Glasgow. In 2005, we had 137 homicides in Scotland. Population of 5 million, 137 homicides. And we were supposed to be the murder capital of Europe, the most violent country in the Western world. Who wants a name like that for your country? Absolutely dreadful. But actually, it's been going on for years. And this is Frankie Vaughan, an American singer, and he was over singing in a concert in Glasgow, and he was so shocked at the levels of violence that he saw that he went to Easter House, one of our housing estates, and pled with the young men to stop fighting with each other. Come on. Oh. Right, so, but in the 1970s, this used to hang in the Strathclyde Police Museum, and when I was a young man, I used to take visitors around and show them, and they always stopped at this photograph. And it was an independence march for Ireland through the streets of Glasgow in Scotland, and the police were in amongst it, trying to keep the peace. And this young man has jumped off his feet with an open razor, and he's trying to inflict it down onto the arm of the police officer who's trying to defend himself. And we don't carry guns in Scotland. The police, all he had was a piece of wood, and he was trying to pull the piece of wood out to defend himself. And the thing that catches everybody's eye, he never dropped his cigarette. But by 2003, this was Glasgow. Groups of youths gathering into gangs and having violence between them. And the gangs were right across the city. And if you walked into the wrong street and you weren't known there, you could lose your life. It was as bad as that. And the police response, lots of searching, seizing weapons and putting them on display as if we've won the World Cup. and putting them into prison. But in actual fact, you weren't sorting the problem. You were just suppressing it. Because other people took up where the young men that went into prison left off, or they served their sentence and came back out and picked their weapons up again. And we never actually came to the end of the problem. And we realized you can't arrest your way out of violence. So this man, very clever man, he promoted me 3 times. And he said, we need to do something different. So he took the top detective for the force and the top analyst. They said, go and look around the world and go and see if you can find something that we can do that can change the way Scotland and Glasgow in particular are perceived. And they came back with this, the Violence Reduction Unit, with the slogan underneath from Nelson Mandela, violence is preventable, it's not inevitable. And since then, in all the charts that you use, violence has gone down. 137 homicides in Scotland in 2005, 60 last year. So something we've done has been right. And what we did was we adopted a public health model. So a lot of people talk about the public health model, and really it means that violence is like a disease, and if you leave it untreated, it spreads from person to person and community to community. But like any disease, it has symptoms. And if you identify the symptoms, you can treat them. And the police in Scotland tended to work in this area about enforcement. A little bit of prevention, but mostly in enforcement. And actually, if you're going to tackle violence, you have to go right across the board, because a lot of it is down to attitude. An attitude in some of the estates in Scotland where we would say, it's always been like this. We've always been violent. It's always going to be violent. My parents were violent. I'm violent. My children are going to be violent. Actually, you need to challenge that. So, and it's one of the slides that were up earlier. For a public health model, you look at the problem you've got, you try and find a way of solving it, you try it out. If it works, you roll it out. If it doesn't work, you go back to the beginning. And we have a lot of partners. It's not just us. We work with health, education, social services, loads of partners. So it started off in 3 phases, the Violence Reduction Unit. The first one was enforcement, because when people are losing their lives on the street, you need to stop that from happening. But it's what happens after that that's the most important, because it's the prevention that's important. Secondly, from 2008 to 2012, we ran this, the Community Initiative to Reduce Violence, aimed at the lower levels, young people going into gangs, getting involved in gangs before they get into organized crime. And we had a series of call-ins. We took information from all the different agencies that were involved about who was involved in gangs, who was encouraging people to become involved in gangs, who was likely to become involved in gangs. And we brought them into the Sheriff Court in Glasgow. We invited them to come in, and they all came in, because what we found was that young people involved in gangs and carrying weapons don't want to. They've largely got into that lifestyle for a variety of reasons, and once they're in it, there's fear. They don't want to be there, but they're scared to leave. They're scared they're going to get identified and attacked. And in the courthouse, we had the police and the legal services saying, if you continue down your road, you're either going to end up dead or you're going to end up in prison. But there is an alternative. And then we had the mothers of victims talking about how their son's life had been lost needlessly. We had former gang members talking about why they were so wrong to get involved in gangs and why their lives were wasted. And at the end, we offered education, we offered jobs, change in house, support to deal with alcohol or drugs, and we offered them a telephone number to call. And if you call that number, we will give you the help you need to stop being in a gang. And one by one, they phoned. And since then, violence has fallen. Weapon carrying has fallen. No gang fighting. So prevention is key. That program that I've just outlined broke the gangs in Glasgow. They've never really reappeared. Small pockets, but nothing on the scale I showed you in the original slides, which is why we can now invite the World Health Organization to come to Glasgow for their conferences. But having done that, you've got to keep crime down. So we moved on to phase 3, which is a series of preventative measures. So we've got a couple of food outlets. And the thing about these food outlets are based on a model in Los Angeles where it's called Homeboys Industries, where Father Gregory Boyle, who runs that, took a whole load of young men who were involved in gangs and gave them employment. So we've done the same. And every person that works in there has got a history of violence. They've never had a job before. They're never likely to get a job. They were never going to be anything other than victims of violence. By giving them employment, mentoring, support, encouragement, they do a year with us in the program, and then we find them a job afterwards, and they turn their lives around. We send 10 young people every year to the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo. It's on right through the summer for tourists. And these young men working behind the scenes, opening the curtains, clearing up after the displays, have all got violent histories. They've never had a chance. Nobody's ever believed in them. And they spend the summer program with the police and with the army and learning the discipline of going to work. Because we believe in second chances. And it's one, I think Anders, one of the speakers up here this morning at the panel, said that we should give people employment. We shouldn't write them off just because they've been involved in criminality. And that's the whole essence of this. People can turn their lives around if they're given a chance and if we believe in them. We've got Navigator. People who sit, they're not from the police, they're from the lived experience themselves. They sit in accident emergency units of hospitals where people come in whose lives are in chaos. They've been victims of violence, they've been perpetrators of violence, they maybe get a drug problem, an alcohol problem, or they're homeless, but their lives in chaos. And they're coming back to accident emergency time after time after time. Our staff sit down with them and say, look, why are you here? Do you want to change your life? Do you want to get back on the street and narrow? And they take it. They take the chance. 73% buy into this. And they take them and get them the services they need to sort their problems. So one boy's story very quickly, because I know my time's limited and I'll fly through this. So Callum was born into a family where his father was in prison for murder and his mother was an alcoholic. And his sister brought him up. She was 4 years older than him. And in his young life, up to the age of 28, he was in prison 8 times. He was in prison in each of his milestone birthdays and when both his children were born. He also made 17 visits to accident emergency, and on the 17th visit, he had 9 stab wounds. One was through his kidney. And the navigators got alongside him and started talking to him about his life, and he took the opportunity to give up violence and stop drinking alcohol. He's not had an alcoholic drink for 3.5 years. And Callum then went on to the food program. He was so good in that we kept him, and he now mentors other young people. In fact, he's become a motivational speaker, and he speaks to audiences such as yourselves about his life experience and how he turned it round. And next month, he's going with me to speak to the Cabinet of the Scottish Government. That's Callum there, and I normally tell the story of why that photo's there, but my time is limited. Khadija works with the people who settle in Scotland from the Horn of Africa, from Somalia and Eritrea, where they've been right across Europe taking violence with them. We don't have that problem in Scotland, and largely that's down to Khadija. These communities are full of absentee fathers, and Khadija works with the mothers, the moral voice of the community, to tell them, we don't accept violence, we don't want violence here, and it's worked. We do silly things like we were given a bus for £1, and we've put it into one of the prisons and got it set up to take services out to the community, because people with chaotic lifestyles can't turn up for appointments with their lawyer or with their charity, so we take the services to them. But education is key. And I think one of your speakers this morning talked about kindergarten, and you'd need to start very young to get the message through that violence isn't acceptable. We do loads of programs. We train hairdressers and beauticians to look for the signs of domestic violence and to help mothers and ladies to get help that they need, have conversations with them. Not so much report it to the police, because sometimes that's a barrier, but get some help to tackle your problem. We also train people in bystander training. There's a very famous murder in Scotland about 5 years ago at a school playground where a young man called Bailey Gwynn was stabbed with a knife and died. There were 30 pupils at that school knew that the young man that did it had a knife, but they didn't know what to do about it. So we train people to understand the problems and get the help you need before something happens. And we train every pupil in Scotland through Mentors in Violence Prevention, where senior school pupils get taught a message of violence prevention and they deliver it to their junior school pupils, mentors. Does anybody here know about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience? I was absolutely amazed this morning that all the talk you did about children and nobody mentioned ACEs. This is a huge thing in Scotland. It's a huge thing right across Europe. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on it than I normally do because I don't know if you've heard of it. So it comes from a study in America by 2 doctors. And they were looking at why certain people from certain communities kept coming back to them time and time again. And they identified that these people that kept coming back to the doctors had more problems that they got from their childhood than anything else. And they came up with this study in 2006. It came to Scotland. So it's 10 factors that if it happens to a child can have a huge impact in their life. And they're fairly obvious. You know, physical neglect, emotional neglect, divorce of the parents, one of your parents being a drug addict, violence in the home, one of your parents going to prison. There's 10 of them. Now, you can have one really bad adverse childhood experience and it can throw your life into turmoil. Or you can have 8 or 9 and you cope with it because of your own personal resilience or the resilience that you've got around you in the community. But studies show if you've got 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, it's more likely that you're going to be depressed, you're going to perpetrate violence, you're going to be an offender yourself, you're going to be an alcoholic. All these dreadful things that can happen to you. And this is from a Welsh study. It shows you what a normal person has. So 35% of us will have no adverse childhood experiences at all. But that's criminals. So the message from that is what you learn as a child will impact on you greatly as you become an adult. And we mentioned it earlier on about the salty soup. What happens in your home gets passed on to you. So if you grow in a house where violence is the norm, you're more likely to be violent. If you grow up in a house where taking drugs is the norm, you're likely to take drugs. And for us, it's about breaking that cycle, finding ways to intervene, to get help for children, to stop them getting involved in criminality. And it impacts on school exclusions as well. So we speak to teachers an awful lot. And what I say to them is, don't look at the behavior of the child in the classroom. Start to wonder why that child behaves in that way. What's happening to them at home that's causing them to misbehave when they come to school? In Glasgow, there's a lady called Maureen McKenna. She's head of education services. And she put this tweet up last year. It said 81% reduction in school exclusions in Glasgow since 2004 equates to a 48% reduction in youth crime. And how she did it was, they had a form they had to fill out if they wanted to exclude a child. And you had to put down 5 reasons why a child should be excluded. She flipped it over and said, look, 5 things you've done to keep that child at school. They didn't exclude any more children. 1 permanent exclusion in Glasgow last year. The one in the orange is English exclusions. It's going the other way. Is there any surprise that they've got the problems that they've got? Our children are really important. We want them to do really well at school. But if another child is misbehaving, they're going to prevent that. So the easy thing to do is to put that child out of school. The harder thing to do is to recognize that that child is also a child of Estonia and that you actually deserve to give them as much chance as everybody else. So let's find a way of keeping them at school. And I talk about Ian Wright. He's a footballer in England. His life was turned around because a teacher spent time with him and told him that actually, it's a story I tell, it takes a bit longer and I haven't got much time. So that's where we are. 60 homicides last year. Remember we started at 137, 62 of them in the home. Average age of victim and perpetrator of homicide in Scotland is in their 30s. This is not about young people. Knives are still the most common weapon. And for that reason, I've got the whole world comes to see me. They come from all around and I go and do these tours and talk about it. And I keep saying to them, it's not over. Because we've got a lot of problems in Scotland. And we share a lot of them with you. When I did my study before I came here, I was shocked at the similarities between Estonia and Scotland. We've got a lot of people in care. 1% of our Scottish population goes into care. They live in a care home or they have foster parents. 65% of our prison population are care experienced. So what goes wrong? What happens that makes the kids with the greatest trauma end up in prison or sleeping in the homeless streets? Why are we treating our young people so badly that that happens to them? They also make up a big proportion of our suicides in Scotland, which are far too high. And we are worst in Europe for drugs deaths. And if you take Scotland away, who's next? Estonia. And we have a violence reduction unit because we had 100-odd homicides a while back. We got 100-odd people die in the streets of driving cars in Scotland every year. And we get really concerned about that. 1,200 people died of drug deaths last year and nobody gave a damn because it's them. But actually, it's the same cohort of people. Scotland's got a huge problem with alcohol. 53% of young men in prison were drunk when they offended. 42% of people in jail for homicide in Scotland were drunk when they offended. We got a problem with drugs, as I've just outlined. And yet, when I come down to England and I go elsewhere, they say, but it's different here. But here's how the similarities right across the globe. Because violence will present itself, the causes are generally speaking the same. We've got a masculinity problem. You don't see groups of women running through the streets, fighting with each other. In general, in the home, it's men that are perpetrators of violence, not women. So we need to recognize that fact. And we need to challenge it. As men, we need to stand up and say, stop doing that. But we're quite happy to turn a blind eye. This is a male problem. And we've all got communities like this, our poorer communities. We call it a harder to reach community. And in these communities, we've got poverty. I'm sorry, I think I'm going too fast for the translator. So we have poverty. But what we do know from loads of studies, including this one from Birmingham University, where the gap between rich and poor widens, then you get violence. And there's people living in these communities who are traumatized, both from childhood and from their life experience since childhood, and they're living with despair. And so they turn to alcohol and drugs to dull the pain of the lives that they're living, to try and take self-medication. And most of the calls to the police in Scotland have an element of mental health involvement. It's getting worse. If people are taking large quantities of alcohol and drugs, it's going to affect their mental health, and they send for the police, and so the police are ending up doing jobs which the medical professionals used to do. And the response from society is again to suppress it. Put them into jail, put them into prison, and turn your eyes to it. So our prisons in Scotland are full of people who have got mental health problems, alcohol problems, and drug problems, who should be in hospital but are in prison. Now, I'm not naive. I did 31 years in the police, and there's lots of people that society need protected from. But we lock up far too many people when we should be helping them. And I've always believed, why do we spend so much money putting people in prison when we could spend it at the other end, give them a better life chance that will stop them going to prison in the first place? It's all about attitude. Because we're brought up, sorry, this is Gregory Boyle, formed Homeboys Industries. He talks about standing in awe of poor people because of the burden they've got to carry rather than judging them for the way they carry it. And this is the second most famous Scotsman, Jimmy Reid. He led a sit-in at the Upper Clyde shipyards, a peaceful sit-in that stopped the yards from closing. And the following year, he was made rector of Glasgow University, and his rectoral address was published in full in the the New York Times. And he talked about the dispossessed, people on the outside of society who don't recognize their political parties, who don't recognize what they see in television. They just feel they don't have a voice. Because basically, we're brought up to believe in good and bad. There's good people and there's bad people. But in my experience, it's shades of grey. And we need to be a more tolerant and understanding society. So it's time for change. And I know my time's running out, so I'm going to rattle through some of this. You can't change where you are because it's brought it to where you are, but you can change the future going ahead. You need to think differently. Because the problems you've got today have been caused by the way we're structured today, and if we want to change it, we need to do it differently going forward. Sometimes you have to change the tide of culture. This is a police slide from Scotland where they talked about locking more people up and throwing away the key and making it harder to visit your relatives in prison. I don't think so. I've needed to change. I was asked to mentor this young man to try and help him get on in his life and find better work chances. And that's his background. So I found out he's a really nice young man. He just didn't get the start in life that I had. So a vision for the future. What does 15 years of our violence reduction unit tell us that we need to take going forward? We need new approaches. We can't keep doing the same things. We need to have a new approach to drink and drugs. Scotland, we're looking at safe consumption rooms as one measure. I would rather have people taking their drugs, if they're going to take them, with a nurse looking after them than sitting behind a dustbin dying. That's what a society that's more progressive should look like. We need to bring our poorer people out of poverty. That's the best way of stopping violence. And we need to use these words. We need to show more love, understanding, empathy, and compassion rather than punishment because people happen to be poor. Employment is the best route out of violence, out of gangs. All our projects show, I should turn this around. Not there's a diamond in the dust, but there's loads of diamonds with a little bit of dust. They just haven't been given a chance. And we need to turn our aces into assets, because when we start talking about the trauma that we've got, about our own childhoods, it makes it easier to understand other people's. I don't have any aces, but my children have got 3, and it concerns me. And when we're talking about violence, we need to stop looking at the police, because the police are only there as one agency. Violence spreads across all agencies. So let's all look at our own responsibilities. We need to pull together. All the agencies need to pull together. We need to work in partnership. And that doesn't mean we go to meetings and agree an agenda and then go away and do our own thing because we want to protect our own budget and we think, well, it's actually their responsibility. If we're truly going to make a difference, we need to work together. And relationships are important. Find the good people in the other agencies. Find the good people and work with them. Build relationships with your clients. Not just see them as some other punter that's come to the door today, but people, real people with problems and chaos that need you to help them to sort their problems together. Overnight success takes 10 years. This won't happen tomorrow. We've been at it for 15 years and we're still at it. But it's about the children. Scotland's a huge ideal, a really important ideal. We want to make Scotland the best country in the world for our children to grow up. I think that's what we should all be doing. I think in Estonia you should try and set that target for yourselves as well. So, A little boy is walking along the beach, and he finds a starfish, and he throws it in, and a man says to him, "Son, why are you throwing that starfish back into the sea?" He says, "I'm trying to save its life." And the man says to him, "But son, in the world there's loads of beaches and thousands and millions of starfish." He says, "Yes, but that one won't die." That's what it's about. I'm just very, very quickly going to touch on this because I think it's really important. Given I'm in a different country, I want to just touch on this. Robert Burns, I spoke to at the beginning. This is a poem he wrote. A man was made to mourn. Earlier this year, I was asked to go to Auschwitz when I spoke in Poland. It really touched me. We all know the stories about Auschwitz and the Holocaust and how bad that was. And I always looked on it, it was my parents' generation and my grandfather's generation. It wouldn't happen now. Then I was asked to go to Sarajevo. By Sarajevo, a city in Bosnia, the Winter Olympics were there in 1984 rather. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union broke up and all the breakdown of everything that was happening, they had a real problem. We had nationalism came up to the fore. Deep-seated problems that had been sitting for years just under the surface rose up. And it resulted in this. And I went to the town of Srebrenica, where 8,500 people died in one day. And I saw the cemetery and I met the survivors. And the change was, that happened in my lifetime. That was my generation that did that. And in Britain, we've got the rise of the far right. And it's going right across Europe just now, and we need to be scared about it because we don't want any more of that. So it's our responsibility to say no. And we need to challenge the people that are perpetrating this. And we need international cooperation. We've got this Brexit thing just now. It's absolutely dreadful. But actually, this is a time where we should be all working together in harmony and in cooperation and actually reaching out and recognizing our similarities, not our differences. Peace is the thing that we're trying to achieve throughout the world. And this is one of my favorite poems of Robert Burns. It's called A Man's a Man, and it talks about at some time we'll all be brothers. We'll not see our international differences or the colors of our skin. We'll just see people for who they are. Really important. When you change the way you look at things you look at change. And that's the message to the Violence Reduction Unit. I would rather build a fence at the top of a cliff to stop people falling off than have a fleet of ambulances at the bottom to take them away once they've fallen. And sometimes to do that, you've got to challenge the system. We stand in front of the tanks. Come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Niven. Some questions?